Developed and published by Namco for the original PlayStation, Klonoa Door to Phantomile was directed by Hideo Yoshizawa, the same man who directed the popular early NES games Ninja Gaiden and Mighty Bomb Jack. Holding on to tried and true side-scrolling mechanics, Klonoa approached platforming in a 3D environment in a more unique manner than many of its contemporaries. Contextually, this was released on the PlayStation after Gex Enter the Gecko and Crash Bandicoot 2, but before Spyro the Dragon and Medieval. 3D movement was all the rage, and certainly no mystery to the gaming world anymore, but just as Castlevania Symphony of the Night had proven, two-dimensional gameplay was by no means any less fun than it had always been. Speaking of its critical response, it even outperformed other popular titles of 1998, such as Final Fantasy Tactics and the PlayStation port of Diablo. However, due to the intense competition of the gaming market in 1998, as well as an abundance of quote-unquote Japanese cuteness, Klonoa had difficulty finding mainstream success with Western audiences. Though retrospectively, Klonoa has been considered one of the greatest original PlayStation games, and arguably one of the best platformers on the console altogether. Its growth as a sleeper hit, as well as multiple awards from gaming journalists, led Klonoa to be remade not only once for the Wii in 2008, but now once again with planned release on the Nintendo Switch alongside its sequel in 2022, before being ported to other platforms. Taking these high scores, multiple remakes, and its cult following into account begs the question, what's so great about Klonoa Door to Phantomile? In Klonoa Door to Phantomile, players assume the role of a good-natured rabbit-like character named Klonoa. As their adventure begins, Klonoa and his friend Hupo, the Wind Spirit, stumble across two villains as they discuss their plans to destroy the dream world of Phantomile. In an attempt to thwart them, Klonoa and Hupo set off through the many kingdoms of this dream world in order to stop the invasion of nightmares. If that seems rather wordy for a platforming game, it's because director Yoshizawa wanted to create a more cinematic game following his dissatisfaction with other developers not prioritizing story, and wanted to conceptualize a world where dreams go when they're forgotten. The dialogue during cutscenes, at least in the original PlayStation version of the game, is entirely voiced in a fictional language, though voiced by Japanese actors. The use of a fake language in the same vein as Simlish in The Sims or Animalese in Animal Crossing dramatically helped the aging of this game in comparison to some other original PlayStation titles, as voice acting had only just begun to be taken seriously in video games. The remake on the Nintendo Wii replaced this dialogue with full English voice acting, including the work of seasoned VAs like Laura Bailey and Daniel Warren. Cutscenes even have unique animations and camera angles. It isn't just text and voices to push the story along. The cutscene movements of the two main protagonists, Klonoa and Hupo, were even recorded with motion capture, despite the cartoonish final appearance. Just like many platformers before it, Klonoa only requires two buttons to play, with controls limited to movement, jumping, and shooting to foster quick inputs and fast action. Klonoa as a character also has a bit of a Yoshi-style float that extends his jump. Oddly enough, this game even feels more like a spiritual successor to Yoshi's Island than Yoshi's Story did. In fact, it feels like this game has plenty of elements that have been refined from other platformer franchises, such as Sonic, Kirby, and even Rayman games. Of course, as is a requirement with all good platformers, Klonoa controls really well. The character's speed, jump, and even the spare inches he can reach with his little float ability all have very clear uses and limitations, allowing the player to feel confident about navigating tight spaces and tricky platforms as easily as they could in games like Donkey Kong Country or Mega Man. Your weapon is just a short-ranged energy blast known as a wind bullet, but what's notable about the gameplay in Klonoa versus most other side-scrolling platformers is that you can also attack towards the foreground and background. The player can activate switches and collect bonuses by completing various puzzles off of the character's path, such as throwing enemies to hit targets in the background. Not only can they be thrown at targets or other enemies, but any foe that Klonoa has taken along with him can be used as a double jump as well. The world of Phantomile is built out of interconnected, rotating 3D environments, but Klonoa and the other inhabitants of the world are comprised of two-dimensional sprites, kind of like the opposite of Resident Evil's flat environments and polygonal characters. The 3D environments make great use of the technology at hand to create visually and structurally interesting levels, while keeping gameplay on an understandable basis for players at the time who were just beginning to transition out of a two-dimensional limitation. There's no confusion about where you're meant to go or allowed to go. Since movement is generally confined to 2 dimensions at a time, either you're able to jump to the next area, or it's simply there as foreshadowing for where the player will be doubling back on an overlapping route. Not only are there crossroads that will split based on whether the player takes the high or low road in one direction, but sometimes, in order to put that 3D world to good use, the game will actually present the player with paths that run perpendicular to each other, with the camera switching to whichever axis the player chooses to travel on. The way the world kind of shifts around the player is an interesting way of limiting movement to 2 dimensions while fully exploring a 3-dimensional world without confusion. The game's camera will tilt and adjust accordingly so that all incoming threats, no matter which plane of existence or direction they're coming from, can be fairly anticipated and counteracted by the player. Enemies will often spawn in the foreground or background and then jump into the same plane as Klonoa. This is a nice little touch to the reality of the game's world in comparison to games where enemies just reappear once their original spawn point is off screen. The artistic team did a great job of not only creating pleasant backdrops to each level, but actually smoothly adding in all of the not-so-subtly floating objects that make up the game's 3-dimensional world. In some instances, you can see the careful use of color gradients or animations around the edges of an object, such as ripples in water, that impressively manage to join together the game's background with what's directly in front of you. Every stage is fun to explore and pleasant to look at. Nothing stays plain for very long, but the scenery isn't overwhelming either. For instance, some of the larger structures, like the cliff sides near the Kingdom of Jugpot or the giant trees in Forlock Forest, have a natural flat color, and then some occasional textures that add detail and give you something to look at. This conservative use of textures doesn't repeat on a tile-by-tile basis like platformers on older hardware, and avoids being as much of an eyesore. Otherwise, vastly differing amounts of light, color, and depth are well combined to create enjoyable environments that twist and turn through themselves, forming unique stages for a unique adventure. It's pretty crazy that this game neither found its way onto the Nintendo 64, nor did Nintendo ever release a truly worthy 2.5D platformer competitor, as they focused more heavily on the transition to 3D platforming adventures. Even a personal favorite of mine, Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards, feels not so subtly derived from Klonoa once you compare them side by side. Kirby 64 was also basically a beat-for-beat remake of Kirby's Dream Land 3 for the Super Nintendo, at least in terms of story and presentation, so fans weren't getting a completely new experience from that game to begin with. The 2.5D platformer format is a vastly underused and underappreciated subgenre, despite what incredible games have come out of it every once in a while, such as the Little Big Planet series, Playdead's indie gaming hit Inside, and obviously Klonoa and its follow-ups. Across the many varieties of talking animal platformer games that pop up throughout the history of gaming, Klonoa is one that definitely flew too low on the radar. After playing just a few levels in this game, it was clear to me why it had already been remastered twice since its release in 1998. While the basic experience of the game was meant to be enjoyable for younger audiences, the optional challenges, shortcuts, and collectibles cater toward the enjoyment of more skilled platformer fans as well. All of the boss fights find unique and interesting ways to create challenges that utilize the game's depth, and the unique environments of each kingdom not only keep things interesting to look at, but also promote a fun 3D experience in a traditionally 2D genre. That is what's so great about Klonoa: Door to Phantomile. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we checked out the dream world of Klonoa: Door to Phantomile. Want to see some bonus content? Maybe support the creation of these videos? If so, check out the What's So Great Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links for all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Dragon Quest III, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.